So what I want to do in this video is get people caught up on what's happening with Cyclops in Marvel Comics right now. And in the aftermath of the Age of Krakoa, Cyclops has his own X-Men team. This consists of Beast, Magneto, Temper, Magic, Kid Omega, also known as Quentin Quire, Juggernaut, and Psylocke. So yeah, his team's a hoss. His team is really powerful. But one of the cool things that we're shown here right off the bat with Cyclops is that he's almost kind of this perfect blend between the more militant and basically villainous Cyclops that we'd historically seen in Marvel Comics, as well as the Boy Scout version of Cyclops that we've also seen over the years that takes a more hardline approach on how to deal with the various threats that the X-Men face. And what I mean by this is that Cyclops had carried over a lot of the lessons that he had learned from the Age of Krakoa. As most people probably know, during the Krakoa Age, the mutant population conquered death, which is to say they routinely backed up their own minds, so that if one of them died, they could resurrect that person and then take that mental backup and put it in the mind of the resurrected mutants. So they would just go forward and be able to tell everybody what was going on in the moments before they died if they were on a mission or something like that. Cyclops took that idea and carried it over. That what happens now is that whenever any member of his X-Men team is caught in some kind of a conflict, or they're ambushed or something like that, knocked out or potentially even killed, in the moments before they lose consciousness or die, everything they see is immediately sent to Psylocke, Quentin Quire, or Magic. And that means they immediately understand what happened when that member of the team was attacked and potentially even killed. So it's a pretty genius strategy, to be honest. We also know that their main method of transportation is the Marauder ship, which was actually piloted by Kitty Pryde and her crew during the Marauders comic as part of the Age of Krakoa, when they were basically pirates. Right? The other thing we end up learning at the outset is that Cyclops is working in a kind of tenuous relationship with a guy by the name of Agent Lundvis, and he's part of ONE, also known as the Office of National Emergency. Now, ONE, or ONE, is a fairly old school organization in Marvel. They've been around since the aftermath of House of M. But the long and short of this is that Agent Lundvis basically serves as a liaison between the government and the X-Men. And there's a couple different reasons why the X-Men operate out of the town of Merle. The first one is because Cyclops makes reference to the idea that his family owns a cabin here, so it's almost kind of retreading his old stomping grounds. But the second reason why is because it was given to him by the government. The reason why this happened was because during the events of Fall of X, Cyclops had been captured and ultimately tortured. His eyes were literally sewn shut, and then he was put on trial as a representative of the mutant population. So by finding him guilty, the entire mutant population was found guilty. Ultimately, it was a kangaroo court, right? It was all for a dog and pony show, and he was going to be found guilty either way. Of course, he was eventually rescued, but as a form of restitution for what had happened during Fall of X, Cyclops was given the town of Merle, and within this town is a decommissioned Sentinel factory. And so symbolically, it was basically Cyclops and his team essentially taking over the factory that produced the very robots that were designed to destroy them. So there was a kind of irony in all of this. We also end up learning that there was an event called the Iron Night, where essentially a wild sentinel had attacked the town of Merle. Now, for those of you guys who don't know what wild sentinels are, as you probably know, most sentinels are produced in a factory, and wild sentinels are produced in the exact same way. What makes wild sentinels different is that they have the ability to draw on whatever resources are around them to reconstitute their bodies so long as their core is not destroyed. And so what basically happened here was that when this factory was being decommissioned and all the sentinels inside of it were being destroyed, it just seems like one sentinel out there, their core remained active. And in sensing the presence of Cyclops and his X-Men team, the sentinel reconstituted itself, and then it attacked the town of Merle. This led to Cyclops and Magneto basically defeating it and then disabling it, and that's the reason why you see this giant sentinel hovering over the town. And so the story starts to pick up when Cyclops and his team basically discover that X genes are starting to activate, and that X genes are activating in adults. Now, for the most part, Cyclops doesn't really treat this as anything extraordinary. And the reason why is because when it comes to Marvel Comics and the activation of X genes, it happens under one of three circumstances. The most common circumstance is puberty, but it can also happen at a young age during moments of high duress. But there's also instances where X genes simply don't activate during puberty. That was the case with Magneto, right? He found out his employer was cheating him out of money, and in a fit of rage, Magneto's powers kicked in. And so using Cerebro, Cyclops and his team tracked down one of these mutants out in San Francisco, and the whole thing happens in the midst of an alien invasion, only for us to find out the mutant they're looking for is a guy named Ben, who talks about how he was taken by aliens and given powers. But we ultimately end up learning that Ben has the ability to warp reality and had essentially created the invasion out of thin air. Now, ultimately, of course, Ben is defeated and his death is faked, and this allows Cyclops and his team to take Ben back to their base of operations with no one being any the wiser to the fact that Ben is basically alive. They also end up discovering another mutant who is being guarded by the villain Trevor Fitzroy. He's got a very lengthy history in Marvel Comics. He basically comes from the future. You don't really see him too often within Marvel, but it is always fun when he shows up. A fight breaks out between the X-Men and Trevor Fitzroy's forces, only for the X-Men to, of course, again, win, and then take that mutant back to their base of operations as well. But what ends up happening is that with Ben in a coma, Psylocke and Quentin Quire go into his mind to find out what was going on with him, why his powers activated when they did, whether there was some kind of nefarious force behind it all, or simply just the natural activation of his abilities. And once they get in there, they're met by Cassandra Nova, who's one of the most powerful X-Men villains in Marvel Comics, and she essentially operates as a kind of security system. So in case anybody tries to get into the mind of Ben, given the fact that she's so powerful when it comes to telepathy, she can force them out. And that's exactly what happens. Quentin Quire and Psylocke are forced to fight these various psychic projections of their own personal conscious and subconscious fears. And while they do manage to make it out in one piece, what they reveal to Cyclops is that Ben's powers are not actually a result of an inherent mutant gene. He wasn't born a mutant. He was given a mutant gene, and then that gene was activated, and it was done by a group known as 3K. Not only that, and while it doesn't necessarily apply to Cyclops himself, we end up learning that Magneto is basically dying, and that the affliction Magneto struggles with is actually an affliction that's going to infect everybody on Cyclops' team, including Cyclops himself. That is something known as resurrection-linked degenerative illness, so basically just a side effect of being resurrected so many times on the island of Krakoa. And so this ultimately leads to Beast developing a cure, but the nature of that cure also enhances the powers of Cyclops' X-Men team. And so that takes us into a storyline called Raid on Greymalkin. Now, Raid on Greymalkin was less about expanding the roster of Cyclops or anything like that, and it was really more just designed to show the ideological difference between how Cyclops views the world versus how someone like Rogue views the world, because the other half of this equation is Rogue's X-Men team in the Uncanny X-Men comics. What ends up happening here, and this was specifically covered in the Free Comic Book Day edition of the X-Men Blood Hunt event, is that a woman by the name of Dr. Karina Ellis had taken control of the former Xavier Institute and then turned it into a prison for mutants, where she was essentially reconditioning them and turning them into servants. So effectively her own henchmen, which she would ultimately use to send out and capture other mutants. And this led to the capture of both Beast and Jubilee. But the philosophy of Cyclops comes into play when he has a conversation with Magic, and he instructs her and the rest of the X-Men that it's perfectly acceptable, and in fact they're encouraged to hurt Karina's forces and even punish them for capturing X-Men and attacking them. But he specifically directs them not to kill Karina's forces. But it's not due to any kind of empathy, it's due to the fact that they're launching an attack against what's basically a non-mutant, and stacking up bodies on top of everything that's going to be going on is going to make life hell for them. And so in the midst of this conflict between Cyclops and Karina's forces, this leads to the showing up of Rogue. And what we end up finding out is that within the old Xavier Institute is Charles Xavier himself, who's been held as a prisoner since the end of Fall of X. Now, the reason why this happened was that during the age of Krakoa, the mutant population's primary threat was Orchis, which originally started off as an organization composed of humans who were staunchly anti-mutant. And during this war, Orchis was ultimately overtaken by AI. And while its war with the mutant population continued, at the end of the Krakoa age, the human race started to see Orchis as a credible threat to its own survival. But because humans and mutants can never quite coexist, when the human population chose to launch a nuclear strike against Orchus's base of operations, Charles Xavier brokered a deal that Orchus would stop its war with the mutant population if Xavier would stop humanity from nuking Orchus. And so Xavier, in what was considered to be a huge betrayal by Cyclops, ended up using his powers to force the captain of Agnew to detonate the ship's nuclear payload while they were on their way to Orchus, which destroyed the ship, but also killed the captain and all the other innocent people on board. But the reason why I bring this up is, again, focusing on this ideological difference and the nature of Cyclops, is that he ends up in an argument with Rogue. Rogue wants to free Xavier because she wants to kind of bring back his dream of a peaceful coexistence between humans and mutants. But for Cyclops, he sees Xavier as a master manipulator, and this goes all the way back to the events of X-Men Deadly Genesis. For those of you guys who don't know about that story, Deadly Genesis was a story that actually told us that there was a secret X-Men team that nobody knew about, that when the original X-Men were captured in the old school giant-size X-Men #1, and the new X-Men team was formed, which was Storm and Colossus and Wolverine, the introduction of that whole team, the secret X-Men team consisted of like Darwin, Vulcan, different things like that, and that Xavier had sent them out unprepared and really with a half-assed training regimen, and they were ultimately destroyed. The only two who survived were Darwin and Vulcan, and it was really more just Darwin evolving himself to merge with Vulcan and then keep Vulcan alive. But this began the perception of Cyclops in viewing Xavier as a traitor. And in fact, coming off the heels of Grant Morrison's new X-Men run, when it was basically Cyclops and Emma Frost that were leading the X-Men, in the aftermath of House of M, they continued to do so. And so the results of this was that even when Xavier came back after House of M, Cyclops told him, "We don't need you anymore." And so over the course of the events of Marvel Comics, between the ending of House of M going all the way up to Avengers vs. X-Men, Cyclops became more and more militant, to the point that during Avengers vs. X-Men, he had had enough of what he perceived to be Charles Xavier's manipulations behind the scenes and killed him. And so that's the foundation of the entire conversation that he has with Rogue. In his mind, if Xavier's out of the picture, they can form their own destiny. They don't have to fall rank and file with Xavier's dream, and Cyclops can lead his own team, basically using his own vision to a degree. And while Magneto does to a degree play the kind of Xavier role, it's in a very minor capacity. He doesn't really feel like classic Charles Xavier. I mean, he does, but he doesn't. And he's almost a background character, truth to tell, for a lot of the stories. But that's the nature of Cyclops' philosophy as it comes head on with Rogue. Cyclops will do whatever he has to do in order to save mutants, even if it means attacking and basically beating humans to near death or even killing them, whereas Rogue has a far more empathetic approach. And of course, these two clashing ideologies lead to a fight between the two of them. The problem is that in the midst of this gigantic battle between the X-Men and the Uncanny X-Men, Dr. Ellis ends up unleashing a guy by the name of Scurvy. Now, Scurvy was a guy who she'd manipulated in order to better understand the nature of his powers and then use his powers in order to take over the Xavier Institute and begin her campaign of mentally conditioning mutants. But Scurvy is a telepath, and in fact, his powers rival the powers of Charles Xavier. And when Scurvy shows up on the scene, he subdues both teams at the same time. The only person who's not really affected by his powers is the Juggernaut, and this leads to Kane Marco freeing Xavier. And so what follows is a kind of psychic battle between Xavier and Scurvy, where ultimately Scurvy's defeated, and then Xavier takes off and goes on the run. Not only that, in the aftermath of the raid on Greymalkin's storyline, we end up finding out that there came a point where Agent Lundvist had actually launched an attack against Cyclops' team in an effort to subdue them after coming to the conclusion that they really were a credible threat to humanity. Basically, his team was just too extreme. And so Cyclops, in biding his time and after dealing with these various threats and just having a bit of a lull moment, ends up forming a strike team out of the Hellions and then sends them after O1E's databases, their servers, their archives, the whole 9 yards, and destroys them all. And so when he's confronted by Agent Lundvist, Lundvist is pissed. And in fact, a fight breaks out between the two of them, and Lundvist threatens to kill Cyclops. The crazy thing about this is that Cyclops tells him that if Lundvist were to pull the trigger, and were to kill Cyclops on the spot, the reality here is that it would initiate a war between the mutant population and humans. And Cyclops makes the argument that while the war may lead to the utter destruction of the human population, which is really what Cyclops would be hoping for more than anything else, that at the very least, it would lead to mutually assured destruction, where both humans and mutants would basically obliterate each other. And that's not taking into account Jean Grey, who was out in space at the time this story was going on, discovering that her husband died, coming back to Earth with the power of the Phoenix, and laying waste to the entirety of the planet. So either Lundvist can accept the fact that Cyclops' team will operate in a way that Cyclops deems to be appropriate, or he risks starting a war with the entirety of the mutant population. The result of this is that Lundvist stands down and walks away. And so following this goes into a storyline called X-Manhunt. This was actually a follow-up to Xavier escaping at the end of the raid on Greymalkin, and the reality is that it just kind of crosses over through a bunch of different X-Men titles, but for Cyclops himself, he's taken out relatively early on in the story, specifically in the X-Men comic. He's actually defeated by Storm, which is actually a reference to Uncanny X-Men 201, which is when Cyclops fought Storm as a test of her ability to effectively lead the X-Men when Cyclops was retiring following the death of Jean Grey. And so for the most part, he doesn't really appear much within the story. But then that takes us into 3K officially making their move against the X-Men. And what ends up happening is that with 3K going around and depositing the X gene in humans and then giving them mutant abilities, it turns out that what 3K had done is they had created their own X-Men team. And in fact, the 3K X-Men go head to head against Cyclops' team. Now, of course, as you would expect, Cyclops' team win, but 3K itself is still operating very much behind the scenes, and in fact, outside of Cassandra Nova, none of the X-Men really know who they are. And so what ends up happening is you get an event called the Hellfire Vigil. Because of the events of Fall of X and the end of the Krakoa Age, the gala had been turned into a vigil, and so it was really more a in memoriam type of event. 3K ends up making an appearance here and then broadcasting both to everybody present at the vigil as well as to the world that their entire goal is to turn the whole of the human population on Earth into mutants within 3,000 years, hence the name 3K. And this would bring about the mutant population having dominance over Earth. Now, following this, 3K takes a back seat, and that leads to the arrival of Doug Ramsey. And so this was Marvel setting the stage for the events of Age of Revelation. And while Cyclops is very much a part of the story, I think it is important to take a second and kind of explain what was going on with the Age of Revelation event. So again, referencing the fall of Krakoa, Apocalypse had kind of gone back to his old ways in the sense that he was always the guy who was testing various groups and so on and so forth, kind of survival of the fittest being his entire philosophy. He had taken Doug Ramsey and saw him as what was essentially his heir. And so when Doug Ramsey shows up here at the X-Men facility looking to join their ranks, almost at the exact same moment, the mind of Cyclops and Beast are yanked into the future. And this is where the Age of Revelation takes place, because we end up finding out 10 years in the future that Doug Ramsey, as the heir of Apocalypse, would basically try to transform the entirety of Earth into a new Krakoa, and he would start within Philadelphia. Now, for the most part, all of Cyclops' story is basically just him and Beast trying to figure out how to get back to the present day, while the future version of Cyclops' mind is stuck in his present day body. So quite literally, it's a mind swap. The future mind of Cyclops comes to the present, and the present mind of Cyclops goes to the future. The kicker about this is that while both Beast and Cyclops are successful in getting their minds swapped back to the present day, we end up getting two big revelations. The first is that the Beast that we know is not the real Beast. The second is that the real Beast is actually the leader of 3K. Now, truth to tell, we kind of already knew that the Beast on Cyclops' team was not the real Beast, and that's something that I wanted to kind of hold off on until we got to this point. The real Hank McCoy had died during the fall of Krakoa, specifically in X-Force issues 49 and 50. He'd actually sacrificed himself. The version of Beast that we currently have on Cyclops' team is actually one of the clones that the original Hank McCoy had made as kind of his own personal army. What ended up happening is that following the death of the original Beast, his mental backup was placed in the mind of this clone of Beast, and that clone had been operating as Beast ever since. What the end of Age of Revelation revealed is that the original Beast did survive and actually put his consciousness in a synthetic body. But when both his mind and the mind of Cyclops were yanked into the future and he went back into an actual physical organic body, he realized everything that he was missing, specifically the significance of having an organic body. And so when he comes back from the future, from the Age of Revelation event, that the real Hank McCoy creates a new organic body for himself and then puts his mind in it, except this time he makes himself white, and so that's why he looks different than he did before. And that takes us into the Cyclops miniseries, but one of the things that I do want to specify is that at the moment, 3K is not a major player in the X-Men comics. We'll circle back around to them, but for right now, Cyclops' team is basically working to make sure that the Age of Revelation never comes to pass. But for the Cyclops miniseries itself, this is probably the best Cyclops has been throughout the entirety of the post-Krakoa landscape in the X-Men comics. The way this plays out is that as Cyclops is coming back from a mission, he's shot down by the forces of Donald Pierce. Now, Donald Pierce is a very old school member of the X-Men villain group. In fact, he debuted back during Chris Claremont's run as part of the Dark Phoenix saga, that he was originally a member of a group called the Hellfire Club. And the Hellfire Club were basically just mutants who were controlling the world behind the scenes, or at least wanting to control the world behind the scenes. This was the first introduction of Emma Frost, for example. This was the introduction of guys like Sebastian Shaw. And so while Donald Pierce is ultimately defeated during the original Dark Phoenix saga when Jean Grey goes crazy and becomes a bad guy, the Hellfire Club ends up realizing that Donald Pierce is also staunchly anti-mutant. And so because of that, they kick him out of the Hellfire Club. And following that, he just went on to form the Reavers, which were basically cyborgs. And his whole motivation was to simply destroy the X-Men at every opportunity he got. All the miniseries was Donald Pierce forming a new version of the Reavers, but they were pretty cool. A lot of it was just manipulation. Every time he created a Reaver, he would tell them that they were special, that they were unique, that they had something that nobody else had. The other cool thing is that during the crash landing, Cyclops' visor breaks, so he actually has to blindfold his eyes and keep his eyes shut the entire time. So effectively, he's walking around blind for the entirety of the story arc. Now, he ends up coming across a girl named May, who's a mutant that has the ability of super strength, but because of the fact that she can't necessarily control her abilities, that in fact her abilities basically disappear whenever she's experiencing high levels of stress, that Cyclops teaches her essentially how to control her powers. But it also turns out that May is one of a handful of mutants that have been kidnapped by the Reavers and are basically digging into a mountain trying to find something, but we're not initially told what it is. Eventually we end up learning that it's Uru metal. And so where Cyclops does confront a couple of the Reavers, May is ultimately kidnapped and taken back to the Reavers' base of operations. And at that point, we get to see how badass Cyclops is when he has to fight without his powers. And honestly, man, this whole segment was basically like a scene out of Predator, when Arnold Schwarzenegger is like setting all these booby traps and things like that. Cyclops is doing the exact same thing. He's picking up plasma cannons, blowing guys to pieces. I mean, it's absolutely bonkers, right? It is quite literally one of the best Cyclops stories that I think I've ever read in Marvel Comics. But he quite readily takes out pretty much all the Reavers. A lot of it's because they're just so inexperienced. They've never really faced off against X-Men before, let alone the leader of the X-Men. And so Cyclops ends up making his way back to the cave where the Reavers are operating out of to confront Donald Pierce. But by this point, Donald Pierce has gotten his hands on Uru metal and has fashioned himself an entire Uru suit of armor. And so where he initially tells May and all the other mutants to get out of there as fast as they can, May ends up coming back with a couple of reinforcements, one of whom has essentially heat vision, and the other can tunnel through anything. And so working together, they incapacitate Donald Pierce, they crack his armor, and that gives Cyclops the ability to blast Donald Pierce through the crack in his armor. Now, it doesn't kill him, and in fact, Donald Pierce is disabled, and this actually leads to one of the Reavers named Tearjerker, the one who felt the most abused by Donald Pierce, basically tearing him apart and just using him for parts. And that whole segment's left ambiguous, with the idea being that Tearjerker would become the new Donald Pierce going forward. Now, we don't know if that's really going to be the case or not, but May also asks if she can join the X-Men, and Cyclops ultimately says no, that he makes this argument that for him, he's an X-Man and and he does what he does so that mutants can basically live a free life. They don't have to follow the dream of Charles Xavier, and they won't have to worry about being hunted and feared, right? They can just kind of build their own destiny. And so following the end of that story, Cyclops ends up going back to the X-Men team, and again, the story's unfolding from there. But that basically gets you caught up with everything that's been happening with his character. Again, I will say that while the X-Men title is one of those either you love it or you hate it comic books, Cyclops has been fantastic over the X-Men comics so far. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, drop a like. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.